Sarah. It's good to see you.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me. We are here with Sarah Jackson, professor at the University of Pennsylvania and author of #Activism and many other things. We're going to be talking about social media and tech solidarity, which is one of your areas of expertise. So, for those who might not be familiar with your work, can you tell me how you developed this interest and practice in the power of media or new media to shape representation and culture?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question because I've always sort of rejected the idea that I study representation. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Um, a lot of times when people talk about representation, they're talking about sort of more superficial representation of particular groups. Is it a positive representation? Is it a negative representation? And I don't really study that. In that I think that there's bigger political questions to be asked. And so I would say that I don't study representation, but I study power. And what I mean by that is that I think questions of representation and power are philosophically and measurably different. And so we know, for example, that we can have a large representation of African Americans in a particular field, but that doesn't mean that African Americans have political, social, and cultural power in the actual life, right? We don't, that doesn't mean that that is extant. And we see that in like sports and music and other things. And so my work is really more focused on, and what I'm more interested in is how people at the margins. So I primarily studied um Black folks, but also women and feminists, queer folks, trans folks, um, resist and upend oppression and attempts to silence them through media and tech. And so I really don't think of that as a question of like representation so much as a question of empowerment. So, how do people use media and technology tools to push for political power, to push for cultural power, to change how we're thinking and talking about particular political issues or cultural issues? In the context of my work, that has looked like studying both what people would call old media and new media, right? Because I'm really interested in thinking about how media is used as a tool by people to intervene in politics and to sort of shift questions of power, right? So my very first book, Black Celebrity Racial Politics in the Press, was about the historical African American press and the way that it responded to and worked alongside Black celebrity protests from people like Paul Robeson, all the way up to people like Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, who, even though everyone remembers Colin Kaepernick now, Abdul Rauf was like the first famous athlete to refuse to stand for the national anthem. And thinking about how the stories that were being told in Black media looked different than how the mainstream media was covering those protests, and what that meant for the sort of interventionist power of both Black activism and Black created media. And so most people now know my work through the #Activism book, which I co-authored with Moya Bailey and Brooke Foucault Wells. But really, the reason I wrote a book about Twitter, the reason we wrote about a book about Twitter is for me, because that was sort of the next place where these questions about struggles over power and struggles over influence and struggles over public discourse, and what was sort of the legitimate window for conversations about things like police abolition, or things like reparations or things like that were really taking place. So those things sometimes take place in old media, they sometimes take place in new media, but that's really the crux of what my work is interested in.
I love that. That was amazing. And I just love this reframing because we still fight about representation in the public sphere. And it's a legacy of that like old media framing of like, there's this mass media and they represent you. And so they have this power over you. And you're getting to the crux of the issue, which is like, well, what is your capacity to challenge that, refuse that, change the narrative, which takes us out of what we see and into who's producing it, who's
Right.
distributing it, right? What's the power to circulate different narratives, which, has historically, like you said, been the Black press, which has been decimated, basically, and is now either not existent, largely owned by white people. And so it was social media that kind of replaced that at the same time. Um, and so, I'm curious, when for you did you realize that social media was this powerful tool. How did you figure that out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I finished writing my dissertation in 2010, and I had been being nagged by a couple friends from graduate school to get on this new microblogging platform called Twitter. I had been being nagged for about a year to join it, but I was writing my dissertation, so I was very good and I didn't. And then, like, the week after I defended my dissertation, I joined Twitter. And if you remember the sort of timeline, basically, this was, I want to say maybe December 2010. And within a month or 2 months of me joining Twitter, what has colloquially become called the Arab Spring happened. And so what we saw was a spate of democratic uprisings across the Middle East. And we in the United States were able to watch ordinary people like us, young people on the streets of Cairo, for example, in Egypt, put themselves in front of tanks, organize themselves across religious beliefs, protest, and eventually succeed in pushing a dictator out of power. And what was so incredible to me was that at a different point in time, these kinds of social movements might have happened, and we might have had to read about them in the news, the next day, or read about them in the news a week later and sort of rely on our foreign correspondents to interpret this for us. But instead, we were just ordinary people online, and they were ordinary people online. And in real life, we were able to sort of develop this kind of solidarity with those folks. So we were all using the hashtag, for example, Jan 25, which January 25th was when the Egyptian revolution started. And I thought that that was kind of bonkers, right? I was just like, this is something new because it has cut out the sort of like elite interpreters of reality around questions of power and politics. We can all see what's happening, and us seeing what's happening is makes it possible for us to put pressure on our own governments, our own politicians. It makes it possible for us to change public discourse around that moment. And I remember, in fact, there was like a spate of solidarity marches in the United States on behalf of folks in Libya and some of these other countries as all of this was happening. So that was like one of the very first things. And then, of course, the first thing I ever wrote about Twitter was about this hashtag MyNYPD. This happened a couple years later, I think, where the New York City Police Department essentially tried to do a public relations campaign. They said, use this hashtag MyNYPD, share pictures of your favorite pictures of, the New York City Police. And they gave an example of a photo of like a smiling tourist with like the mounted police, on horses. And we'll share it on our Facebook page. Use the hashtag MyNYPD. And, I tell the story now and everyone immediately starts to smirk. But when they first did this, it was early enough in the Twitter days that people didn't understand that this was going to go awry. And I watched this thing happen where ordinary people, not celebrities, not journalists, not activists, right? But ordinary New Yorkers, people who then followed ordinary New Yorkers, people from all over the country started posting images of police brutality, and not just contemporary images of police brutality, which were coming out of the most recently response to the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2012. But also they were posting about Amadou Diallo, for example, the shooting of Amadou Diallo, which happened way pre-Twitter. And so there was this way that they were circulating narratives that fundamentally questioned the rights of police and the power police have in our society. And that's what trended the hashtag. And so this was the first thing where I just said, oh my gosh, I have to study this, because this is doing the sort of subversion and questioning of alternative or activist media that we used to primarily see in the press, the prison press, the anarchist press, the socialist press, right? At some points of time, the Black press, the feminist press, right? But this was happening in this sort of like real time, rapid moment where ordinary people were succeeding in reframing the narrative power of the state. And I just thought that was amazing. So that's kind of how I started and why I started studying social media, because I saw it sort of just like the printing press was to the abolitionist movement, right? As a tool or a technology that people could use to fundamentally change and shape the Overton window in our society and sort of the terms in which we engage in debate and think about power.
Yeah, I mean, that was really a whole moment because there had been social media for, 5 to 10 years before that. But it was largely kind of like, I'm connecting with my friends, I'm sharing photos, it's all very cute, it's all very nice, which was a lovely time. But this was kind of the dawn of the news feed and of people really onboarding onto these platforms. And so that was also around the time of like the first Black Lives Matter movement, which I think young people don't remember that 2020 was not the first Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, People were like, "Oh my God, I have this tool, and when I say something, other people are listening, including it,
Yeah.
like people in power as well are seeing this.
Hmm.
Like, everyone's
Hmm.
kind of on the same terms, at least at that moment."
Yeah.
And there's still that still happens today a little bit, right? We did have Black Lives Matter 2020. We've had other movements since, um, but it does seem like things have changed. On the one hand, Arab Spring was maybe the first time that social media kind of ignited what was a global protest movement. And then maybe that culminates in Black Lives Matter 2020, which I think was like the largest global protest in history. Um, but something has changed since then. So I want to talk about that, but I want to make sure that we don't miss the thread of like what value did people get in the 20 teens from social media? I'm taking you perhaps to your hashtag activism book. Sometimes it was direct speaking to power, but there were other things that you noticed too that people were kind of using these tools for. So
Yeah.
I'm bifurcated questions. Maybe
Yeah,
to
I'll
like,
try to answer both. Yeah. I mean, I think I'll answer the second question first, because it's a bit simpler. I mean, yes, way more things were happening and have happened through technological tools because at the end of the day, like I said, really the questions I'm asking my work are about agency, narrative, power, and so forth. And so it wasn't just that people were using these tools for activism, they were also using these tools for identity, group identity formation, for community building. You saw, for example, as early as 2012, trans women on Twitter were finding each other and sort of using those connections to fight the isolation that they were feeling in the small town in Ohio they lived in, or in the church community in, Delaware they're a member of, or whatever, right? And so people were using these tools to build real community. Of course, shout out to Andre Brock's work. They were also using these tools as like sort of what he would call like libidinal for fun, right? For jokes, for building community. But all of this was also about identity formation. And this was one of the moments where, I remember you used to see the kind of jokes on Twitter about what it was like to have a holiday meal, for example, with a Black American family, and you would get like Nigerian Twitter or South African Twitter be like, wait, like that's kind of like what it's like here. And so you started getting these like diasporic kind of moments of identity formation. So people were using these tools for all kinds of things, and also, of course, for news, right? Which I think is the main thing that has stayed maybe the same. So that's my answer to like, the ways folks were using these tools, community building, not just activism, fun, entertainment, news, all these things, not just activism. Um, I think to your first question, I forgot it. Can you tell me what the first
yeah,
question
because
was?
it was a long one, but I do want to make sure that we highlight that really important time where if you were especially young and Black and trans or queer or whatever, you would see these hashtags, you would see people posting, that they have your identity. And of course, they're different, but you also have this connection, right? And that ability to understand what are our points of connection, but also what are our differences was hugely important for people feeling just secure in themselves, right? Just like loving themselves
Yeah,
in a
for
way,
sure.
like um you have this, great chapter in your book about Girls Like Us and the Black trans women that really started and perpetuated that hashtag. And, we know that Black trans people are so under the gun
Right.
societally in so many ways. And it's so hard to build up a sense of self. But I think the people who came up in Twitter at that time really kind of like bucked themselves
Yeah.
up, like,
Yeah. And in some ways, I mean, we argue in some ways it was life-saving for certain people, right? Because you can imagine, and we know this, the sort of levels of scrutiny and isolation that especially subalternated groups face in our society can be really detrimental to their mental health, can be really detrimental to their physical health. And so being able to build that community and build joy through it was like a huge thing. I think I know what I was going to say now, which was that, you were talking about how like there was this period and yes, like the early Black Lives Matter moment too, which was around the murder of Trayvon Martin, and the activism that again really came and started with like sort of ordinary young Black people in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin, which is how we first got the Black Lives Matter hashtag. But I think what I was going to say is, I want to go back a little to pre-Twitter to say that I get the question a lot now that Twitter doesn't exist. X and the way that it is managed and its sort of like policies and infrastructures have made it a fundamentally different place and a much less safer place. And the sort of cultural and political power of social media, I think in general, has really shifted. And people keep saying, what's going to be the next Twitter? What's going to be the next thing? And I keep saying, well, nothing. And that's okay. Because I'm old enough to remember that the way we found Twitter was because we started in the blogosphere. And, very few young people now think about blogs, but there was this really, 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 like active and vibrant feminist blogosphere. There was an active and vibrant Black blogosphere. There was an active and vibrant queer and trans blogosphere. There were all these like blog spaces where people were in the comments. I had a blog, you had a blog. We were commenting on each other. We were reblogging each other. We were sharing, right? We were posting our blog posts to, our back then seemingly more analog social media, right? And a lot of the early adopters of what was then new Twitter came to Twitter because it was advertised as a micro blogging platform. It was essentially a place where you could write like a short summary of your blog post and link to it, right? And that was that blogosphere moment. Like in some ways, we built community in similar ways that we later built community in this kind of like bigger and more networked space. The community was maybe smaller, but we were often having super intimate, political, heated conversations and debates with strangers who were like in the same blogosphere as us, right? And so, and I'll give a nod here to Catherine Knight Steele's work, who, she has written about how the blogosphere continues to be an important space for, Black Americans. And I think that, this is a thing that we forget, that there's the pushback I often give to like people framing Twitter or framing social media as uniquely good for certain types of activism or certain types of communication or certain types of politics is, look, media changes, technology changes, it always has, right? But what we know about our people, what we know about folks who have, in order to survive, had to be innovative, had to come up with new ideas, have had to hack technologies like from the very start, right? We know that people will find the next thing to use in an innovative way. And so that next thing might look different. It might feel different. It might have a different kind of reach. It might be limited in some ways that the last thing wasn't, but it might also make some things possible that the last thing didn't. And so I'm always like, yeah, it was awesome. And also we started in the blogosphere. And also before the blogosphere, like we started in like MySpace. And also before that, we started on IAM, right? And also before that, we literally read, the City Weekly, magazines, and we were still doing those, and those moments were overlapping, and like we were reading alternative magazines, and we were doing all this stuff, and these things have kind of always overlapped, and technology has always overlapped. And so I'm less concerned about like, are we going to still be able to do that, and more concerned about like, it'll be so fascinating to study how we do that, right? I mean, people will figure this out.
I sure hope so. Thank you for bringing the millennial maturity. I feel like this is like our job to like remind the new generation that like digital, yes, is new, but it's not that new. It's actually like 20 plus years old and has gone through waves, and people have survived through all of those waves. And also, it does feel like we are in a particularly strange moment
Yes.
in media. People, I mean, it's interesting to think about X being taken over by now the richest person in the world. And, we're about less than a month from the inauguration of the latest president, surrounded by these technocrats who own all our platforms, who in some ways have supplanted most of the media before them. I mean, YouTube is worth more than the old broadcast networks.
Yeah.
A lot of these platforms have decimated the revenue streams for the mainstream media. And so it does feel like we are in a particularly intense moment
Yes.
with regard to power and media. So I'm curious, what concerns you now? How are these platforms not serving these critical roles of supporting identity formation, community building, and information dissemination?
Yeah, well, I mean, everything you just laid out is what concerns me now. But I mean, every billionaire is a policy failure. And I think we are living in a moment of kind of intense and extreme policy failure. And I'm really not sure what's going to happen because there's policy failures on a couple levels. One is that anyone is allowed to become as rich as Elon Musk, right? Or as rich as Peter Thiel, or like you could rattle these guys off, who own these platforms, but also that they're allowed to buy them, right? And so in my kind of other hat, I co-direct a center called the Media Inequality and Change Center, and one of the things we think and talk about a lot at that center is the idea that media should actually be a public good. Media and technology should be something that benefits the public and that belongs to the public, right? And the privatization of mass media, of the tech industry, of research that results in tech innovation that has been sped by sort of the rise of global neoliberal economic policy for I mean, let's be honest, for our whole lives, but it became particularly rapid in the early 90s. And also the simultaneous deregulation of previously existing regulatory sort of policy, but also ethics that those policies were based on, right? And so I always warn people against glorifying a historic moment in mass media when things were better, because we know historically a lot of people were excluded. There was a lot of elitism. Maybe it wasn't a billionaire who owned the thing, but it was certainly somebody who had some kind of vested ideological interest. But what we did have was a FCC that was breaking up media conglomerates, that was saying like, actually, no, you can't own 1,000 radio stations or whatever, right? And we don't have a powerful FCC anymore, and we don't have a lot of those policies anymore. The Telecommunications Act, like all these things, there's a long list. And so I think the thing that really concerns me is that combination of kind of the privatization, the deregulation, and the ownership questions, which of course are all, in bed with one another and inextricably tied to one another. And the way that actually, really delimits our imaginations about what media can look like and how we can make it and what stories we can tell, because it becomes increasingly harder for ordinary people to successfully make and circulate their own media. It becomes, you have to compete with, think about local bookstores competing with Amazon, right? And the way that this has not just decimated kind of local businesses but spaces of community, right? Local bookstores are spaces where you saw your neighbors, you found something in common with them, you went to public talks, you like sat and had a cup of coffee with your neighbor, right? Like you organized whatever meeting to do XYZ. Like local bookstores were an important part of civil society in the public sphere. And the idea that Jeff Bezos has kind of like displaced this in a lot of communities is deeply disturbing to what we can or think we can do with media, I think, but also what we can and what we think we can do in society at large, because we have fewer of these kind of democratic style meeting spaces. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, this question of like what's not working, all of that is not working. And unfortunately, I just feel like I don't actually know what the answer. I mean, I know what the answer to that is, but like I'm not sure that I'm living in the timeline where the US government is going to re-regulate all this stuff and tax billionaires into non-existence. So I'm not sure what the realistic solution to those problems are at this point. Other than that, we're gonna have to watch how the next generation kind of resists this contemporary moment in what I would call like media abuse of power.
Oh, love that. I mean, that was a whole word. Thank you so much for that because it's so true. And I think what I often teach my students in my classes is when I teach television, the initial idea behind mass media was that both radio and television was that the public owned the actual technology for distribution, right?
That's
It was
right.
this was a physical technology. There were waves in the air, and the idea was that no corporation could actually own that, that those corporations licensed that right to reach the public. And of course, that had its problems, like you said, because there was this idea that, well, now the government should highly regulate those corporations so that they can't defile the public's trust in any way, which led to very conservative representations that maybe weren't good for our culture. But there was this idea that, but they, we have to put like some restrictions on what they can do, how much they can own, because that's going to affect our culture, which is owned by everybody. And like you said, we've grown up in this era where that's just completely gone. And ever since like the 70s and 80s, it's just been no, corporations going to own more and more and more. And it's just so important for folks to realize that that's not the way it's always been. So it's not the way it always has to be, right? Like
Yeah.
we can have digital public infrastructure. Like, y'all, we can own Twitter. Like,
Yeah. Well,
advocate for that.
yeah, and I love that you mentioned the infrastructure because I think the invisibility of the infrastructure is what has in part allowed this to happen. Because if you go into any city or any rural area or any place in America and maybe the world, and you explain to people, yeah, in order for like internet to exist, in order for Comcast to be your provider, right? There are cables under the public street that you live on, right? In order for us to communicate with people on the other side of the world, there are deep sea cables that media companies have to put into the ocean. And is who does the ocean belong to, right? Does it belong to anyone? And the idea that there is literal physical technology and infrastructure, right? In order for AI to work, they have to build these huge plants that are guzzling water, they're guzzling air, they're guzzling like they're huge polluters, right? We know that. And these are often on land that at one point in history was public land, might still be public land. And so there's a lot of questions about this, right? Like if we take this question of rights to infrastructure and rights to sort of the world belonging to the public, then there's a question about why some of these companies aren't paying more taxes to run their infrastructure through public streets. There's a question why companies aren't being told that if they want to put in deep sea cables, they have to make an equal investment into oceanography research or something like I mean there's real ethical questions here about when we decided that because the infrastructure was invisible we no longer wanted to regulate it. And of course when I say we didn't decide that, but it was definitely in someone's interest to decide that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I definitely want to ask you about, we're in this environment where corporations own so much of our means of communication. How is it possible? Well, what are the challenges that that brings out? Is it algorithms? What does the profit motive do to how we connect to each other. Because you mentioned, going to your local bookstore, and there is that sense that our media institutions were the things that connected us to each other, that like helped us
Mhm.
see the value in each other, to see how we were mutually dependent on each other. And it does seem like the transactional nature of just capitalism in general, right? No matter what space you're talking about, media or otherwise, makes people think, well, I'm in it for myself. I got to get mine. And that's something that's, I think, one thread that's like challenging our culture right now. But I want to ask you, like, what do you see in these platforms that is challenging us?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, which brings me back to something that I harp on constantly in my work, which is that I am I have done work where people often kind of refer to hashtags as movements, or they refer to a particular set of ideologies that circulate online as a movement. And I am constantly saying, just to be clear, the Black freedom movement has existed in this country for hundreds of years and has morphed through different iterations. And there has always and will always be an offline version of this, right? The queer liberation movement has existed in this country for many, many, many decades. And there has always been an offline sort of like community and set of organizing behind this. You could say this about any kind of, you know, set of political resistance, and not just that, but also like the joy, right? I mean, like if you think about the way that offline spaces are the gathering spaces for marginalized communities, right? I recently went roller skating in a, like a Black neighborhood roller skating rink, and just like, if you've done that, what the vibe is. That these offline spaces are core to who we are, to developing our identity, to feeling safe, right? And so I think this question about like how should organizers or how should cultural storytellers or how should, et cetera, folks respond to this very depressing contemporary state of platforms and social media. I think the thing is like dig in and remember that like that's not all that matters, that like the real place that organizing and community building and all these things happen has always been offline, sometimes, over a meal at a kitchen table, right? Um, Sometimes in churches, sometimes, in backyards, sometimes in, like roller skating rinks, right? Sometimes in bars, right? And so I think that this idea of building a kind of radical or resistant and independent infrastructure that doesn't solely depend on platforms that are owned by billionaires is a smart one, right? And I'm in relation to, I mean, obviously I'm speaking to the choir here because you have done this, like you have been part of not only building kind of an alternative type of media, but doing it in a way that centers community, right? And that brings a certain type of ethics. But, in addition to giving you a shout out and your sort of team OTV a shout out for that, I look here in Philly, you can look at an organization like the Black Star Film Festival, where, the Black Star Film Festival, they not only do independent films that center sort of transnational Black and brown filmmakers and stories, but they have a mentorship program. They have year-round kind of like programs. They have physical space. They have community, like they build, right? They do events. And I think that seeing the way that sort of independent media spaces have always been connected to social change, right? I mean, I'm also thinking here in Philly of Scribe Video Center. This is a throwback. It's like, this is one definitely that younger people probably won't know, right? But I will welcome them to Google it. There have always been these spaces where people who are thinking radically about storytelling, about narrative, about how to assert power through media. And those people are often in conversation with activists, with cultural workers, with, new generations of even politicians who want to actually genuinely create change, right? Um, that is always and has always been a thing that we do. And I think that we can continue to do that. I think um, seeing, for example, the demise and denigration of X should not be the end all or be all of anyone's question about, like, well, how do I publicize these community values I have, or how do I make, tell independent stories? Like, there should be all kinds of other ways, through community connection, through community space, through this kind of like innovative thinking, that folks can do that. So I think sometimes we've come to maybe depend too heavily on these problematic platforms, when in reality there's kind of always been there's always been a model for existing or doing things outside of them.
Yeah, I'm smiling because, as you know, you are preaching to the choir. And really like preaching right now, because I do think that, especially for young people who don't remember the pre-social mediated world, like, they've come to see activism through these platforms. They've come to see community building through these platforms, which, like you said, is possible. But when those platforms were designed for profit, it motivates in a very subtle way over time your engagement to be a kind of profit motive, right? I mean, so many scholars have written about the branding focus on these platforms, how you've essentially become your own distributor, which means you become your own brand, which
Right.
means you stop really talking to people and speaking with people and more just like shouting at them, And, imagine doing that in community space. Like, you can't do that, right? Like, that's not actually how you can be a person in the world. You were going to say something? Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna agree with what you're saying. Yeah.
So I love that you're taking us back to what I would say are really these kinds of like ancestral practices that we've had of like how we gather, like churches and like cookouts, and just like the ways that we have gathered together, where we understand in this space that when we gather, we are all equal. We treat each other equally. We treat each other with respect. And through that process, we come to a shared identity that helps us make us feel comfortable in our own personal identity and connect our personal identity to a larger community, which is then how we build power, right? Like, when you're talking about the Black freedom movement throughout, the hundreds of years that it's existed, it has been through those ritual practices, right? Like,
Right.
before there was the Black press, it was the church, which was what? Gospel music. There was a medium that helped us understand who we are and rally us to survive very harsh circumstances. And for the civil rights movement, we had a whole Black media ecosystem. We had the Black press, we had Black
Black
radio stations
radio.
with
Hmm.
Black music, right? And like, we all knew the same song, so we would like see strangers on the street and the song would come on and we would like have a little moment, and then it was like, oh yeah, we are this community, we are strong together, right? And like you said, it might just be that we have to maybe go back a little bit,
Yeah.
like,
Well, I think at least embrace the ethics and spirit of that. And so I think what I mean by that is, like, I think the contemporary media environment and the sort of huge global power of social media and technology, as well as the capitalist interest in influencer culture, have been the reason people have forgotten this. And so, like, what you're saying is essentially like, what is not useful is trying to be an influencer, right? If your values are like what I'm interested in, re-narrating power, telling new stories, representing voices and communities that are your own or that haven't been represented before, like, you can't be an influencer, because when you're an influencer, you're just out for yourself. And you also can't be concerned about the number of likes and views and whatever, because in order to make art and in order to tell stories, sometimes you have to start small and in community. And I think, like, there's many historical lessons about this, right? From literally the small community that Harriet Tubman started her revolution from, right? But like, I often think of the Los Angeles School of Black Filmmakers, which is also sometimes called the LA Rebellion, which, like, I'm sure you know, right? And this is like sort of like a school of young Black folks who they got into the various, prestigious film schools in Los Angeles, sort of like at the end of the civil rights movement and because of forced integration and all these things. And they walked into these fancy film schools that were training, the Martin Scorseses and the Francis Ford Coppolas of the world. And they discovered, of course, that there wasn't really a well-rounded representation or even attempt, right? I mean, again, I kind of like throw out the word representation, but there wasn't even really an attempt to embrace a Black aesthetic or Black ways of knowing or Black histories. It was come in and assimilate and tell and make films the way we tell you. And for about a 20-year period, starting in the 60s through the 80s, this awesome group of Black filmmakers went through these schools and they just said, we're not going to do it. We're going to make films in a different way. And there's countless people you get from that school, but Julie Dash comes out of the Los Angeles School of Black Filmmakers, right? And her film, Daughters of the Dust, I would argue, fundamentally changed not only how stories about Black women are told in the United States, and you see it in everything from like Beyonce's music videos to like literature, you see it everywhere, right? It changed the aesthetics of film. It changed how time was played with it in film. It changed how spirituality was played with in film, right? And she did it by telling a story about the Gullah, right? The Gullah Islands, the Gullah Geechee. And it was a story no one had ever told before. And you could say, well, Julie Dash isn't the most famous, most wealthy, most influential filmmaker in the world, right? And if she had wanted to be, maybe she wouldn't have taken that approach. But what she did was fundamentally shift our culture and shift how we tell stories and shift how we see and think about telling Black stories, right? I mean, in the later era of that same sort of like generational shift in film is Spike Lee. And you could say, I mean, critiques of Spike Lee, there are those to make, but Spike Lee has also fundamentally changed how film in the United States is made, how Black stories in the United States are told, right? To the point that you get white filmmakers trying to replicate, right, a lot of the sort of like aesthetic norms that people like Julie Dash and Spike Lee put in their films, right? Frankly, that's how you get a Quentin Tarantino, is because he's doing Spike Lee impressions. But so I think that this is like interesting because again, you could say that for the folks that came out of the Los Angeles School of Black filmmakers to do this, were they solely concerned about their own careers? Look, let's not deny this. They wanted to get paid for their art. They wanted to get paid for their talent, right? And I mean, I know you know this from doing OTV. It's the same thing, right? We're not saying sacrifice your career, sacrifice your vision for the good of the whole, right? But what we're saying is like, actually, maybe the good of the whole can be as much of a priority in the stories you're telling, right? And I think that the influencer culture has really undermined that sort of like collectivity in politics, collective vision and influence. And so like I hope we can sort of resist that moving forward, right? Like I hope we do less of like the I'm the the most famous person to use X hashtag and like think about actually like what are we doing offline in community? How are we telling these stories? Because that's what's always gotten us through.
Yeah, shout out to, I love that you mentioned the LA Rebellion. Shout out to Jacqueline Stewart and Allison Field and Zainabu Irene Davis, who did an incredible documentary, Spirits of Rebellion, about that, that you probably can get through your library. So many of these filmmakers that we hold up were developing work in community, right? They were working out their ideas in physical space with people who shared their identity, their vision for the future, who also had different aesthetic strategies, of course, but they understood that like they needed to support each other. And so much comes from that isn't visible. It isn't
Right.
Beyonce becoming a billionaire,
Right. Right.
It's
And
very,
they were playing with technology and innovating technology. I mean, this is something
yes.
my forthcoming book, which is about Black media makers and sort of the cultural history and influence of Black media makers. Like I talk about this a lot. It's not just that the stories were being told different; it was how, right? So if you look at somebody like Barry Jenkins, who is like a contemporary of ours in filmmaking, the way that Barry Jenkins plays with like light and aperture through the camera, he's talked about this in interviews. He has developed a different way of shooting black skin using the technological tools that were available to him, but kind of like hacking them, right? And so I think about this in relation to social media too, like to get back, to the question around like social media and new media, right? Is that this is part of how we do it. Like you find ways to sort of like hack and innovate, and you use the tools that are available to you. And it's not just that you're telling a new story, but in some cases, it's actually that you're coming up with brand new uses for the technology, right? Um, my favorite, I will never not talk about this because it's one of my favorite historical facts, is that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man of the 18th century. And you're like, how did a runaway slave, a person who liberated themselves from freedom, right? This man was the most famous he was so famous that he was photographed more than any white person of his era. And why was that? Was that just like a coincidence? Like we're led to believe, oh, people just, it's because Frederick Douglass saw that the photo technology was being used by abolitionists to show, the whipped backs and the degradation of slavery. And he said, well, I would like to put a suit on and like look regal and like have this. And this was a redefinition, a new image of the formerly enslaved, right? There were others that did it before him, but in combination with his kind of like visibility as an activist, and his role in building coalitions with people he sometimes didn't agree with, right? And other things, like people were taken by these images. And I think about this a lot because what we know is that era, there were Black photographers. Like there were many Black photographers who were part of the free Black community and the Black abolitionist community that were insisting on taking noble photos of formerly enslaved people instead of sort of like the degrading ones that the white abolitionists were taking. And that Frederick Douglass himself took inspiration from that, right? And so there again, you have a technology that's being used one way, and then it's innovated by the folks to tell a different kind of story, to represent something else. And that becomes in a way viral, right? Now, of course, you could argue that, Frederick Douglass was the influencer of his time. If you've ever read any biographies about him, he's quite an interesting character. Bless. But, this is like, I think this is a good example of how like this technology is always begging us to kind of like use it different, do something different with it.
Yeah, totally. Shout out to our friend Jasmine Cobb, who wrote a beautiful book, Picturing Freedom, about how Blackness really changes the actual purpose and use of photography as a technology.
Yeah, I think Jasmine was the first person to tell me that little factoid about Frederick Douglass being the most photographed man, and I repeated so much that I should cite her every single time I repeat it.
It's hard to remember where we're talking to. There's so much good scholarship on Black people and technology that people are not aware of. We've been kind of like trying to cite as much as we can, but there's so much richness here. I think about the use of the like what DJs used. I'm not a DJ, so it's like now it's CDJs, but it was different in the 70s. But like Black people changed how music was made.
Absolutely.
DJing, right? And that created
Yes.
electronic dance music, which is like one of the dominant music forms today. Or I even think about the little known Black public television movement of the 60s and 70s, and how the idea of public television itself and how to produce a TV show and what TV was changed by these programs like Soul and so.
Soul, I was just gonna say Soul. Before Soul Train, there was Soul, right? And like you have to really see it because it's like, oh, the idea for this kind of variety hour came from somewhere, right? Where you have a politician and you have an activist and you have a musical act and you're like in conversation, about the culture in one place, right?
And
Yeah.
the fact that every episode could be different. I mean, when I saw Soul for the first time, shout out Deborah Heitner, who was screening clips of it at the Whole House 10 years ago, I was like, I've literally never seen TV this radical since, and that was 50 years ago.
Yeah, it's
Um,
amazing.
There's a beautiful documentary, Mr. Soul, which I think is out of distribution,
Yeah,
but
it's made by his niece, right?
yeah, it's Melissa Hayslip, Ellis Hayslip, who was the host of that show. So I just, if you want to see that documentary, email Melissa and tell her that you want to, so that maybe someone can see this, because it's truly incredible.
Yeah,
Black people have done with technology throughout the years, and we've always done it in a way that also builds community, which I think
right.
is just so key. So it is a bit of hope in these dark times.
Yeah,
We've been through dark times, and actually technology has helped us survive, but we've got to be creative with it. This is the old Audre Lorde master's tool thing.
yeah, absolutely.
And it's not don't use the master's tools, it's understand how they're using it and use it in a different way towards different aims. Like, be conscious with it. Use what you have in a conscious way, and you can do great things, maybe.
Yep.
I want to talk a little bit about these tools as we wrap up, to ask you, with the tools that we have available today, be they platform based, be they social media, what's the one thing that if you could change it or you could use it in a different way, if you could flip a switch and say, let's just not do that, what would you do? And then conversely, like, what is the thing that you think we actually can do with the current tools, to achieve liberation, or however you want to frame it, equality, etc.? This is a tough one.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure what I would say. Here's the one thing I would change, I mean, I don't know. I right now I'm very annoyed about AI. So like I think just my self-serving answer would be like, could we uninvent that, please? It's terrible for the environment, and it's making people learn poorly, and it's mucking up our information system in a way that is bad for everybody. But I mean, I don't know. Depending on what day you ask me, I might give you a different answer to the undo thing. That's my thing right now. The second part of the question was what?
What would you keep? Is there still something in the existing ecosystem that you're like, this gives me hope? We should keep doing this thing. We should, I don't know, share infographics, or, use
Like
hashtags.
one particular practice.
Yeah,
I mean,
or a
I
set
don't
of
know. I
practices.
think, because of the nature of my work, I'm very interested in how technology and media are used for political education in particulars. And when I say political education, I mean like consciousness, what in social movement spaces we would call consciousness raising. So I'm always interested to see how people take, for example, a platform like TikTok, which again, like I'm giving a lot of caveats here, a lot of problems and critiques to be made about TikTok. But I'm interested in seeing how people can take a platform like TikTok, which is really designed to kind of produce the most vapid content, like, the most like kind of brainworm vapid content possible, and use it for political education. And so I'm thinking about people who have been, use TikTok to make political education videos about like the history of Israel and Palestine, or they're using TikTok to make political education about the history of Haiti. And, why is it that Haiti is in the situation that it's in today, right? What is this history of colonialism with France? What is this history with like immigration policy with the US, right? And so I'm thinking about how that is true on Instagram, that is true on some of these new platforms, that have attempted to replace X. That was true on X, that people are constantly using new technologies to engage in political education, but also forms of really subversive political critique. And what I mean by that is like political critique isn't always like a serious, PSA to the camera, but sometimes it's really subversive. And it's sort of like poking fun at the bear, so to speak, poking fun at power, making jokes at the expense of the oppressor, which is such an old tradition for us, right? And so like I think about that as something that people continue to do through all sorts of different technologies. And I love the jokes, right? So I think the jokes that are about that are the punching up jokes, love it.
Yeah, I mean, it can be serious in terms of like a Twitter thread or an X thread or whatever, or an infographic on Instagram or a short TikTok that just kind of gives people like, here's some resources, check this out or whatever. Or it can be fun, right? It can be memes, it can be, um,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, just editing things in fun ways that kind of show what's really going on. And those are the kinds of things that, I asked you about like what's one specific thing. It's like it's not about the tool per se.
It's about how people are using it.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
just to remember your creativity, your imagination, and that ultimately, you're trying to have actually fun and just like connect with
Yeah.
people,
Yeah. For sure.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. We ended up
Yeah.
talking a lot about history, but I think that's a good thing.
I'm on a history kick right now because my current book project has a lot of history in it. But yeah, it's been so great to talk to you. I feel like I failed to give one shout out, which is that I actually deleted my X account, and I feel like I mean, this is a personal thing I'm on, but at this point, I think the ethics of this, even for somebody who wrote a book about what the former platform and loved it and built community there, I feel very strongly about this. Again, I don't think there's a replacement, but I do want to give Blue Sky a shout out because I personally like it. I mean, I know there's like a series of other, alternatives, but I think one of the things that we're good at is taking alternatives, experimenting with them, taking what works, and maybe we'll take what works and build our own thing. But it's been fun to kind of play with some of these newer replacement platforms as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good answer to my question too. Like one thing we can do is just actually divest and invest
Yeah,
in non-commercial, community-owned, or just
absolutely.
better run platforms
Yeah.
that are actually trying to like
Mm-hmm.
something that's positive for society, maybe.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
Thanks for spending the time. It's been great to chat.
Yeah. Good to see you. Thank you.